I think one of the best techniques I gave to my students when I was teaching was to see if there's a question asked at the beginning of the story, like, will this world be saved? The blowing up city thing. And then what kind of answer is given at the end? Yes, it's going to be saved. No, it's not going to be saved. We're all going to colonize a new planet, whatever it is. So take those 2 points, the beginning and the ending point, which on the storyboard would be the point 1 and point 5 because there are 5 points on a storyboard. And then consider point 3. So take your question that you begin with, will this city be saved? And see if you can twist it.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. I'm Matty Dalrymple, and this week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Mary Carroll Moore about perfecting your story's trajectory, including the value of having a visual map of your story's structure, the importance of understanding the triggering event that generates the crisis and the turn from outer to inner crisis, the power of considering how the question posed at the beginning of the story maps to the answer given at the end of the story, adjusting a plot to meet genre tropes, the often overlooked arc of setting and avoiding setting cliches, and using a storyboard to check for cause and effect. And now, let's hear from Mary. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Mary Carroll Moore. Hey, Mary, how are you doing?
Hi. Nice to be here again.
Yes, it is great to have you here. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Mary Carroll Moore is the author of 14 books in 3 genres, including the Amazon bestselling novel and hot new release, A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue. And in fact, I met Mary when I interviewed her about that book as part of my What I Learned video series. And then I was so intrigued I had to read A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue, which was wonderful, and I can highly recommend.
Thank you.
It had 2 of the things that intrigued me either personally or vicariously. Aviation. I think we talked about that earlier, that I took flying lessons for a while, and my husband's a pilot, so the aviation aspect I thought was fascinating. And also my husband's the front man in a band in the Philadelphia area, so I also very much enjoyed the band-related aspects of A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue. And Mary is also the author of the PEN/Faulkner-nominated novel Qualities of Light. She has taught storyboarding and writing craft for 2 decades at writing schools around the U.S., including Grub Street in Boston and the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis. And I invited Mary on the podcast to talk about narrative arcs. And so I think it would be helpful just to start out to make sure we're all coming at this from the same perspective. How do you define narrative arcs?
It's a great question because there's a lot of different ways to define it depending on what writing books you read or classes you take. But for me, a narrative arc is the trajectory or the path through story that mostly the character takes, how the character evolves from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. But also I use narrative arcs to refer to the evolution of setting images and also plot. So for me, the narrative arcs weave in 3 ways, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, well, let's dive right in about what those 3 aspects of the arc are.
Okay. So when I've taught storyboarding at different writing schools, people come to me with the big question of structure. That they're really, a lot of writers are confused about structure. We know how to flow things. We can sit down and do NaNoWriMo or get all those words out on paper. And then when we come to actually analyzing the draft for whether it holds together structurally, this is often the biggest problem. So when I worked as a teacher and a coach, I found that there were a lot of manuscripts that had the beautiful story and setting and characters, but there weren't that many structural elements that were solid, so that the reader kind of lost track of what was going on about chapter. So we're talking about creating a deliberate structure that you start with, and then you can go into your writing that is flow writing or free writing, but you always have this visual map to come back to. And so the easiest one to start with is plot. And people are used to doing all kinds of plot outlines, Save the Cat and storyboards. There's just so many different ways to do plot outlines. I use a W storyboard because it has an up and down movement. And that is the thing that plots usually forget to do, like the middle. There needs to be something happening in the middle that really pulls the reader into a second reveal, a second crisis. So we have the starting crisis that's usually in the beginning chapter or early in the book. And then we have a middle crisis that develops that original one, makes it even harder, worse. And then that will, lead us to the place that the things are resolved. A character has to face themselves, or Something has to change in order for the plot to be resolved. So that's in a
So,
nutshell how this particular approach to narrative arcs works.
so let me ask a question about that because you were saying that, that the plot arc is the good one to start out with. Do you find that the stumbling block that writers are facing is that they have the idea for that primary arc, but they're forgetting
Mhm.
about that secondary one that keeps pulling the reader through in the middle? Or is it just that
Yes.
is
Yes.
it missing or is it just ineffectively constructed?
Well, that's a really good question. It's often missing, but if it is constructed, it doesn't tie back into the first one so that the first one has to generate, it's called what I call the triggering event. It has to generate the crisis that runs through the first half of the book. But then there's a place in the middle of the book where things have been resolved to some extent, but something new has to come up. Some new crisis has to come up, new information. Oftentimes this is where there's a double crossing or a betrayal or something that you thought was true is not true. And oh my God, there's another big problem to solve. So this problem solving has to be in my feeling, has to be in stages. If you dump it all on the reader at the beginning, which many writers do, they think, okay, we're going to blow up a city and that will create the entire story. But it's not really true for the character part of it because characters evolve and they might have solved that first problem, but what happens to the problem inside themselves? So having a second crisis often in the plot often allows the character that evolution that you need to create that, like what's the character's arc, the character's narrative arc.
So what that made me think of, and I think because you mentioned blowing up the city, and I didn't think about this ahead, so listeners, bear with me. But what it made me think of was the Will Smith movie that was, I think it was called I Am Legend, but it was at least based on the book I Am Legend. And it's where Will Smith is in the sort of post apocalyptic world and is trying to escape the zombies. And what I thought of was the scene where, spoiler alert, his dog gets bitten by a zombie or wounded by a zombie. So now the dog is going to turn into a zombie. And that's both, I think, kind of that secondary hook that's going to keep the reader
Mhm.
interested, but is also very revealing of the character's personality. Is that
Right.
actually an example of what you're talking about, or is
That's
that
a
an
great
example of
example.
something different?
No, that's a great example because what you're
Okay.
looking for in that second crisis is something that will reveal a deep part of the character, something that hasn't been shown yet. Because characters present a certain way, even in literature, and they think they're this way, and then something has to happen to make them actually more vulnerable, more revealed to the reader, so the reader can actually get behind them. And this is a big part of literature today. I think we used to go for like action stories that didn't really have to reveal any character, but then action stories, thrillers started to reveal character. And then that started to be part of our culture as readers. We have to understand a person and who's behind this event and get to know them. And even if we don't like them, there's somebody that we are connected to by the end. And I think that point in the middle, in my particular narrative arc, storyboards, that's where the reader gets to know the character. So, yes, a great example, Maddie.
Yeah, that example of character arc, this is an example that I think comes up each time is the James Bond character. Like, I think if we were having this interview, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, James Bond was always the example of the exception that proved the rule that James Bond has no character arc. And yet, I think as time went on, the screenwriters or the writers added that because I think it was something that current audiences would have been disappointed not to see.
Yeah, and I'm really intrigued by this. So I'm reading an older thriller that I love that's called The Dog Stars by Peter Heller. He's a
Mhm.
literary thriller writer from Colorado, and he's won all sorts of awards, and he's very prolific. But this Dog Stars was his first book, and I was kind of preparing for this talk today with you, and I wanted to look at a book that I love and find out why I'm so invested in the character. And it turns out that he has a crisis right at that point of the mid book where it causes him something personal happens to him, and he causes him to make all these decisions that he wouldn't have made before. So he actually takes the risk that he had talked himself out of because he's lost something that was incredibly valuable to him. And I thought, wow, what a great structure. He's got that plot point in the middle that causes the character to face something, the end of his world. So then he has nothing to lose. He can go ahead and move forward into this huge risk, which of course creates the second half of the book and turns out really good in the end. But I think, these good writers, the really good ones, you can kind of take their books and analyze them and find that second point.
So
I
I sort of
know.
took you from plot arc to character arc, but is there more you wanted to talk about with regard to the structure of the plot arc and what writers should be looking for to assess the plot arc in their own work?
I think one of the best techniques I gave to my students when I was teaching was to see if there's a question asked at the beginning of the story, like, will this world be saved? The blowing up city thing. And then what kind of answer is given at the end? Yes, it's going to be saved. No, it's not going to be saved. We're all going to colonize a new planet, whatever it is. So take those 2 points, the beginning and the ending point, which on the storyboard would be the point 1 and point 5 because they're 5 points on a storyboard. And then consider point 3. So take your question that you begin with, will this city be saved? And see if you can twist it. What happens if this city is not saved? And then what other question would evolve from that? For instance, would we leave this city or would we try to save it? So that there's kind of a new question asked at the center of the book. So that seemed to help people just to start with a question, figure out the answer at the end, and then break that question up so that you have a second question at the middle. And that's the thing that you can base your plot point on or your character change on. For instance, in this Peter Heller book, we have the question seems to be, am I going to survive this terrible situation that's happened to the world? What will my life be like? Will I ever find love again? Can I stand living with this person that I'm living with, who's the only other survivor that I know of? And then in the middle, the question is, how will I live without this thing that I've just lost? So it becomes more personal. It's almost like there's an individual question or a limited question in the beginning, and then that evolves into a more universal question in the middle. And that seemed to help my students sometimes, just to think of it as first in terms of questions and answers, and then a midpoint question.
Yeah, I like that idea of applying sort of like the rules you learn about writing a newspaper article, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and
Right.
say in the middle point, say, well, is a good question, how is this going to happen? Or is it a good question, why is this going to happen? Or to whom is it going to happen? Or whatever.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to approach it. Yeah.
I was talking about Alien with someone, and I was trying to apply that. I'm trying to think in Alien, because Alien seems to me to be sort of, at one level at least, a very straightforward, there's a monster. Are we going to get away from the monster kind of plot line? And I'm trying to think if there was that moment in the middle, in the way that there was that moment with the dog in I Am Legend. I
Can you
remember,
think about the character? Like, is there a question that the character asks in the middle that's different?
uh,
So, are we gonna get away from the monster, but is there something that becomes more personal than just the escape? Or am I gonna be able to save someone, for instance, is often people take it out of just the initial crisis into something more personal.
yeah. I guess the
I don't
only thing
know.
I'm thinking of is that, and I finally remembered where I was talking about this, was a patron event with Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor, that there's this romantic interest that I think was inserted late in the game. It seemed like the kind of thing that was probably slapped on there at the end because they decided they needed a romantic relationship. So there was this kind of twist that it wasn't, all the characters weren't equally important to save. That's but, there were people that I think the viewer wanted more to survive the encounter with the alien than others, the captain being one, when it became clear that there was this relationship between Ripley and the captain, and some of the other characters were sort of odious, and you didn't really care when they got eaten up by the monster. Just never mind. I don't think that went anywhere useful, but it's what popped into
Okay.
my head.
Okay.
So I keep taking you off on these little sidetracks. Maybe I'll keep this in just because it's fun.
I think it
So,
is.
the yeah, so are there other examples you can think of in addition to the dog stars where
Oh.
there are these questions? Because I've never heard anybody talk about structure in quite this way, with this question in the middle that provides the impetus for drawing people through. I think it's worth some careful examination.
Well, can I use my book, The
And
Woman's
please,
Guide to Search
yes,
and Rescue? Okay.
yes.
So this book, I had to structure really carefully because I was working with the same dilemma that I had a woman who starts off with a plane crash. She escapes from the law and she crashes her plane and she has to meet her estranged sister. So I thought, okay, well, that's a great start. It all works. But what am I going to have in the middle? Because she's injured and she's stuck in a cabin in a blizzard, which is the worst kind of plot point you can imagine to work out of. You've got someone stuck in a room or a cabin or anything. It's really a bad news for structure. So I had to figure out what would happen in the middle that would change everything. And so what I thought was, what if her sister discovers her there and she decides to first turn her in and then decides to help her? So that it was about the two characters coming together. And the middle of my book is a fight, basically a fight scene with the two characters. They've decided that they're not going to collaborate. They're not going to be sisters. They're not going to be family. And the sister that finds the hidden sister, so Kate is the search and rescue pilot, and Red is the one who's escaped. And so Kate finds Red on her property, endangering her own daughter, and she's got to make this huge decision about what she's going to do. So that was my second plot point. And I decided to put that kind of in the middle of the book so that there would be not just the story of the search and rescue outwardly, but the search and rescue inwardly. So that is what turned it from the outer crisis of the fleeing and the crime being investigated and Red being wanted by the law into something that's more important to me in this story, which is about the unity of the two sisters and how they're going to come together. And at first, of course, they can't. So the crisis is, oh my God, Red is in danger. She's come all this way and she can't get help. So that was the point where she lost everything. And Kate also, in a sense, lost everything because, she's been lonely all her life. And here's the chance for her to have family. And she says no, but just because of her own rules and her decision to be somebody, I would never help somebody who's slightly shady, suspected of a crime. So that was kind of my example of what I could do. So that changed everything. And now if Kate's going to help Red, then all of the rest of the book comes together. Suddenly they're a team and Kate uses all her skills. She goes out to the woods again and she finds the missing item that will exonerate Red. So all of the things that happen later are the things that will actually create the rest of the story. So not to just point at my own work, but that was an example of me struggling for years trying to figure out, well, how do I get her out of this stupid cabin in a blizzard? What can I create here? Well, what if her sister finds her and then refuses to help her?
Yeah.
So that would be like the bottom, a moment of, nothing is worse than this. So I guess that would be an example.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I did have a question. And we're sort of giving spoilers away for lots of things, but I don't think it would deter anyone from actually getting A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue based on our conversation. But one thing I was expecting that didn't happen, and it didn't lessen my enjoyment of the story, which I thought was wonderful, but did make me wonder, is that I was expecting that the bad guy, Cotton?
Billy Cotton. Yeah. Good.
So there's the sort of flashback aspect of Red and Billy's interaction before the story takes place that sets the stage for what happens later. And then there's the altercation with Red and Billy, I think, kind of in the middle of the book, maybe a third of the way or through, or something like that. But then I was expecting Billy to show up at the cabin because what I thought it was building to was going to be the big climactic confrontation where Red was going to save her sister and her niece from Billy, who shows up in the seemingly safe place.
Well, I had that in there. I did.
So can you talk a little bit about how you made the decision there?
Well, I had him come back and burn the cabin down with them in it. And I thought that was great. That was like the last, big conflict scene. And the feedback I got was, it's too much. It makes it more thriller than women's lit. So I'm really interested in the women relationships in this book. I think that the whole idea of women heroes and found family and all of those aspects, those are the things that really do it for me. The thriller part, I'm not really a thriller writer, so my feedback was, you've got too many murders, like too many things happening here, and you've got to tone it down. And we don't really need Billy again. We really are invested in the sisters. So I reluctantly took that out, and that's going to be an outtake. I'm going to surely do something with it because it was a fabulous scene. And Alex ends up shooting Billy, and he dies in the cabin fire. And I thought, oh, this is great.
So he doesn't actually burn them with them in it, and then they all die except Billy, right? Like
no, he
the
starts to set it on fire, and and Red is alert and finds him and goes out and tries to talk him into, anyway, there's a whole thing where she manages to get him into the cabin, and then she and Alex escape, and he's drunk and he's basically a mess, and he lights the cabin on fire and burns in it. I thought that's such good justice for him,
Yeah.
But
yeah,
then
that
I
would be super
decided,
fun. You could do one of those,
I
like, pick
know.
your own adventure and say, do you want this to be
Exactly.
more like women's lit, or do you want this to be more like a thriller? Yeah, I was also
Yeah,
wondering if the daughter was, or the niece, to what extent the niece was going to be like the thing that Red and Kate saved, or was the niece going to be more instrumental in the rescue of the three women? Yeah, I would be super interested in seeing that alternative ending.
I'll do outtakes. I love outtakes anyway. I always watch them when I watch a movie. So
yeah,
it's fun, and I really did appreciate the advice that I was not a thriller writer, because I don't think I am. I think I am a definitely women's lit. So I really like the relationships, and I had enough thriller in there to make the plot fast. And people tell me that they read it in a very short time, like 3 days or something like that. So that's great.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I really wanted the relationship to be the primary thing. So
So
I had to
I'm
give up my
curious-
cabin fire.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious as to how you thought through the question of, and now we're completely off character arcs. I think, maybe not, but what made you decide that the tapping into a thriller trope as opposed to a women's lit trope would lessen the emphasis on the relationship of the women, and therefore it's not something you wanted to tap into because it would take you in a direction you didn't want to go?
Well, that is back on the arc. So that's a great question.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So everybody starts, in my experience, everybody starts with either plot, character, or setting when they're doing their arcs. Some people are so into setting, you can't believe it. And that the whole, first draft is all about how beautiful the trees are, or how desolate the abandoned city is, and they're so into the world building. Then there's the people that only do the character first. They do character sketches and biographies, and they basically do everything they can to build their character. And yet the characters don't drive the plot, really. They just sit around and they have good coffee and they talk. And that's how a lot of the books are that I would see at first or second draft. And then they're the people that are so plot driven. They have this thing, and then they have this thing. And then I remember reading manuscripts where I was exhausted just by reading it, because so much happened, and you didn't really have time to process what was happening. It was just one event after another. So that's why, for me, the mingling of those 3 arcs is so important, to be able to say, what is my entry into this story? So my entry is character. I'm not a plot person. So I came in via the characters. I had so much written, maybe 5 years written about them. And then my agent said, you need a plot. So I went and hired an editor who was a thriller writer who works for UCLA writing program. And he taught me how to build a plot. And I decided I really wanted, this kind of scary thing to happen, because I like thriller. I like reading them. So I went ahead and built a plot based on, his suggestions, and it was great. And then I came back to my agent and said, here's the book with the plot and the characters all woven together. And she said, you have too many things going on, and now you have to reduce the plot. So she helped me, because I had to go back to my strength and my entry point, which is characters, not plot. And so when I went back to characters, I realized I had enough plot to form the story, to make the structure work, but the characters were the heart of it. And that's where my strength is as a writer. So I think we all have to kind of know where we enter story, and how not to transform ourselves into something we're not. Because that was my lesson, and that was a costly, many-year lesson. But I'm glad I worked it out.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? please consider supporting it and all the work I do at The Indie Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/The Indie Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. I think that's also a great example of when you're picking the people from whom you're going to accept critique. Be sure that your expectation, their expectation, and your and their expertise is aligned. Because I think there's a lot of conversation about, if you're independently published, the importance of having a professional editor look at your work. But I don't think there's as much conversation about the importance of vetting the person that you're going to be getting the advice from. Because exactly as you're saying, every person's bringing their own preferences and expectations to that, and it could lead you down a path you don't necessarily want to follow, as you were describing it did in your case at first.
And I'm such a good student. Somebody who I respect says, well, add another murder here. I'll do it. And I'll just add, even if it's not my strength and the thing I really want to do, I'll go ahead and add the murder. And then I'll say, oh my God, I have taken this way far from who I am. So now I have to say, okay, I'm going to cut back. I'm going to come back to the core of the story that is me. And now I'm so happy because the book came out the way I wanted it to, even with the missing outtakes that I'll enjoy aside from this. The book is what I want. And people do comment that they don't want to end it because they don't want to leave the characters. And that's the thing I really wanted from my readers, is that they get so involved in the characters, they don't want to stop reading them.
So I think the people who are very interested in characters often go the series route, because now you have book after book where you can delve into those characters, like the arc of the story, but also the arc of the characters in a more complex way than you can in an individual book.
It's the second of a series, kind of, Qualities of Light was the prequel. And I do have a whole outline for the third book. If I really want to do it, where Kate and Red go to find their father. Because that's the missing piece for their relationship, is that the father who's betrayed them both has another family and has a daughter that he's taught to fly, who is now their half-sister. And, so that may come up for me. I don't know. I have another book coming out next year that's not about this group of characters. It's a different book, but it's also a novel. I don't know that I have to take a break for a while, and then I'll come back probably and consider, what do I do with the characters of Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue and their missing father? Because that's like a question mark at the end of the book.
It is a question mark.
I do like series. Yeah.
And it's interesting because if you decide that you don't want to pursue that, your next book comes out, you're enmeshed with that, maybe that takes you into a different direction, then you have to have made sure that if someone only reads A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue, if someone reads the prequel, or, any combination of those things, that the character experience they have is satisfying. Do you have any tips about that if you're thinking of character arc and you need to accommodate both people reading across a series or reading a standalone book?
I remember running into that when Philip Pullman's books, The Gold Compass and all of those, there are children's fantasy books that I loved. And I remember them creating the movie for The Golden Compass, and they left it with this huge bit of hanging story. There wasn't that feeling of completion that his book had. And I was so mad as a viewer and reader that the movie didn't have that sense of, okay, yes, this is part of a series, but I need closure. And so those question and answer techniques that I gave earlier, if the writer can answer that initial question and at least give the reader some satisfaction that something has been wrapped up, then I think a series works really well as standalone too. But if the ending of the book is so dependent on not resolving that question that we asked in the beginning, either I would suggest that the writer rethink the question, or somehow give the reader enough material, enough change, enough sense of satisfaction so that they don't have that frustration that I had with Golden Compass movie. Because otherwise, I'm just you lose me completely. I need to have some closure at the end of a book, even if it's part of a series.
It's interesting thinking about this in terms of my own two series. So the Anchor suspense novels you can read them in order, and, there's some benefit to doing that, but they're more standalone. You could pick them up in any order. That would be fine. And in the Lizzie Ballard thrillers, you're definitely a very obvious overarching arc. So there are 3 books out now. And then the fourth one is coming out in January 2024. And that will be the first of, I'm anticipating another set of 3 that will have a continuing, but, sort of
Wow.
self-contained arc. And for all the books, I only have the most general possible idea what the overarching arc is going to be for the second trilogy. And fortunately, so far it's worked out. Like, I'm really pleased with the arc as represented in the first trilogy, and I feel like relatively confident that the arc of the second trilogy is going to work out. But I can imagine getting to book 5 and going, "Oh my god!" Like, I know what's going to happen next. And then there are people who, they plan out their 10-book series ahead of time,
Oh.
which I just think would be so difficult because I think you learn so much when you're writing the book, and then you might get to the end of book 3 of your 10-book series and say, "Oh, man, this person really wouldn't do what I thought they were gonna be doing in the next X number of books."
I'm so behind that. I really agree. I've never been somebody that could plot that much. And I think that the writing process for me, I'm more of a pantser than a plotter, but I tend to grow the book as I write it. I don't know what these characters are going to do. Since I'm a character based writer, it's very hard for me to say, well, by the end, she's going to do this and this and this. Maybe I'll have a sense of by the end, she's going to have a certain level of satisfaction about this question being answered, like found family. Do I have a family or don't I have a family? I think I can answer that one. But as far as what happens to the person in getting there, that's the stuff that evolves as I write. I didn't know Red, for instance, was a self-centered person in the beginning, but she definitely is. She doesn't think about this family that she's fleeing to and what danger she's going to put them in. So the fact that I had no clue of that until I had completed the draft and then realized, oh my God, she's changed by the end. She's now aware of other people. She's aware of the danger she's brought, and she's willing to make amends for that. That was a big deal for me to learn as a writer. But how do you sit down and figure that out ahead of time? Maybe if you're a plot writer, you don't have that problem. But for me as a character writer, I'm with you, Matty. I just can't know that ahead of time. I have to evolve it.
Yeah, I think there's probably the consideration that forms the foundation of what you want to achieve across a series, and then you can tweak the other aspects accordingly. So for me, the arc of what I anticipate will be the second Lizzie Ballard trilogy will be, uh, mainly around the relationship of the protagonist and the antagonist, and having it start, let's say, with them very much at odds, but evolving so that in the second book, they in some way, they would have to join forces against an even bigger evil. And then in the third one, in some way, they have become well, one of them makes the sacrifice, decides to sacrifice herself for a greater good. And so having that is even that general idea, just knowing that, I feel like, okay, that's enough. I can proceed with the series knowing that that's enough structure. And I know that because that trajectory is based on the characters, then I can adjust the plot to accommodate as opposed to a trajectory that's based on plot, and you would adjust the characters as needed in order to
Right.
achieve that.
That's exactly it. So
Yeah.
I adjust the plot. I create the plot based on what the characters need to learn. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I find that very satisfying as a writer. I don't like doing it the other way, although when I studied with the thriller writer, that's what he taught me how to do, basically have your plot be the most important thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that, yeah, as we're talking about it, I'm thinking that the basing it on plot, and I'm saying this as someone who's basing the trajectory on character, it would be more difficult to base it on plot because you have to keep coming up with new ideas to keep it interesting for
Mhm.
yourself, not to mention the readers. Whereas with characters, if you've created characters you really love, then I think just naturally you want to spend more time with them. And then you find ways to put them in situations that enable you to spend more time with them.
Right. Right, exactly. And they generate the ideas of,
Yes.
okay, I ask myself, what does this person long for? And what have they lost? And then from those 2 questions, I can go into, oh, they long for this and this, and then I can create the plot points based on that longing. And then what have they lost? Then I, again, have a list of things they've lost, and then I can create plot points based on, well, what if they reclaim that in some way? So the character for me always drives those plot points. It's fun, it's a really
Yeah.
great way to approach writing.
Well, when I talk to authors who are writing, especially in a series, a lot of times the conversation is around, I need to have this happen plot wise. What can I get the characters to do to enable that to happen? And I think, oh, that seems really backwards. But then I'll read the resulting book and I'm like, well, whatever they did, it worked because this is,
Yeah, it worked.
this is a great story. It's a great plot. It's great characters, it's a successful result. And whereas for myself, I hold the plot up to the characters. So I have one of my little sayings for my craft is you need to be able to explain everything the character does by saying she did this because, not she did this despite the fact that. So she went into the dark basement when she heard the mysterious sounds because the rabbit hutch was down there and she had to make sure the rabbit was okay. Versus she went downstairs despite the fact that she just heard on the news that a crazy person had escaped from the local mental hospital and was known to hide in people's basements when he got out. One of those works and one of those doesn't. But
Yeah.
that's because I'm looking at it from a character-centric point of
Right. And I
view.
think that works for me best. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
After you.
I was just going to talk about setting for a
Yes.
moment because that's the third arc that people often forget about, especially writers that focus on plot. They think the setting is not really important and they get bored by it in other books. So, long descriptions are not their thing. I would propose that the setting, and you probably heard this before, is a character. And so, one thing you can do is look at the weather and chart the weather for the different plot points that you're going to be doing and see if the weather can become a problem in those plot points. And so then you have an extra element of tension that both the characters and the plot have to deal with. So I found setting to be really a fun and tricky thing to. I actually chart the setting, what it looks like and the temperature and all these things by day in my novels. And I find that I can really use that, not to be like cliched about it, like a dark and stormy night, but the idea that a setting is going to create more and more problems for someone, might give them an injury, for instance, or might make them lose something, or they're forced to stay in a place that they want to escape from. And you can't really do that completely with plot. You have to have other elements. So I just say to all those plot writers out there that hate setting, this is a possible addition and a positive for your narrative arcs.
Well, I like that because I have a standalone that's coming out next year and the weather plays a very strong role in it. And whereas I think with both plot and character, you want that kind of, you don't want it pegged at 11 for the entire time. You don't want people dying in every chapter. Maybe some people do, but I
Right.
don't. You want kind of an ebb and flow. You want to give the reader like a little rest
Mhm.
between the more exciting or emotionally intense parts. But I think it's interesting with setting. I think you can have sort of a straight line. Like in my story, the temperature gets colder and colder and colder over the course of I mean, some of the parts of A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue reminded me of this. It's a straight line from the beginning of the book to the end of the book in terms of the falling temperatures. And it kind of creates the ticking time bomb because you kind of know, oh,
Mhm.
if I follow this trajectory, we're going to get to a
Mhm.
problem at the end. You don't necessarily need to have the same kind of up and downs in a setting arc. Do you concur with that, or does that seem weird?
I do. Yeah, I do. And I just wanted people to know that it could be a really positive element in creating tension. And it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be cliched. But like yours getting colder and colder, that's definitely going to force the characters to do stuff and that'll force the plot to be some way. So it's
Yeah.
a very important to me it's a very important element.
Yeah.
So it's part of your world building, people buy into worlds now. It's really important in literature for me at least. The world is like something that I relate to as a character. And if the world is built well and the world changes as you go forward, then I'm really hooked. So,
Yeah, I'm a
yeah.
big fan of probably more description of setting than I think is fashionable to advise these days. Like if somebody goes into the bar, I kind of want to see what the bar looks like. I'm not happy with just she
Mhm.
went into the bar and sat down and ordered a beer. And I think that thing about what you said about cliches is really important because I'm just buffing up a chapter at the end of my fourth Lizzie Ballard book, and it's where the big physical altercation happens, and I look back on my other books and I'm like, yeah, there's one that happens, like, during a sleet storm, and there's one that takes place during a big storm in an Adirondack cabin. I'm like, I don't want to keep going back to that. So I'm having it be
The
like a
storm.
beautiful
Yeah.
sunny spring morning. But then you've got to like say, despite the fact that it was a beautiful sunny spring morning, it was still creepy and horrible, but you
Yeah.
don't want it
Well,
to tap into a dark and stormy night. Any tips there for how people can get around relying too heavily
the
on,
darkest storm.
on tropes for setting?
I'm going to follow your lead, and I'm going to say, what if you did the opposite?
Yes.
Because that even makes it creepier.
Yeah.
So if the thing happens on a completely beatific day, and the weather isn't a factor of negatives, then that's even more. What if you can play with that?
Yeah.
I like that idea.
And you could even, I mean, it offers some nice opportunities for character development because you can say, how come despite the fact that it was a beautiful, balmy spring morning, she was still miserable? Or what about it set her
Mhm.
teeth on edge? Or how come, she's complaining about the sun being in her eyes when she shouldn't? The
Well,
character's reaction to the non-traditional setting can be illuminating.
and what if you took that another step and asked about the memory? So the character's got all this backstory, right? And so things happen at certain times in certain kinds of weather, and they have memories of setting. And then you can pull the memory of that setting in, and it can be something that will enhance the miserableness. So
Yes.
you want to make your characters as miserable as possible so they'll be forced to act, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Or mean.
What are the things we do? Rubbing our
Yeah,
hands together and cackling evilly.
I know. It's one of the few places we feel like we have control over our world here.
Yes.
Ugh.
Well, Mary, I took us pretty far afield. Was there anything else about narrative arcs, plot arcs, character arcs, setting arcs that you would like to cover before we wrap up?
One small technique that I have suggested, and by the way, listeners can look at my YouTube channel, and I have 3 different storyboarding videos, tutorials there. So you can check out how storyboards are built from those YouTube channels. But the one thing that I'd recommend is once you have a draft that's pretty solid, that you're pretty pleased with as far as the plot points, I personally take each plot point, major and minor, and put it on individual index cards or sticky notes. And then I'll put them on my wall. I have a wall in my office, and I'll try to see if there's an effect from each thing. So it's not going to be, I think I heard once, you don't do this happened, then this happened, then this happened. You do because of this happened. So I'm looking for cause and effect. And so I have all these plot points that I've decided. And now I'm going to see, does the second plot point connect to the first one? Does the first one create the second one? Does the second one create the third one? And you can check your cause and effect for your narrative arc that way really well. I find when it's all written in a manuscript and it's on my computer, I can't separate out in my mind the different plot points. So this physical storyboarding on my wall really helps. And you can do that again with the character arc as well to say, okay, the character makes this decision in chapter 3. Do I set that up well in the previous chapters? So does their state of mind or state of being create that decision point? And then does that decision point create their next change? And basically you're analyzing the character arc that way too. So that would be another kind of technique that I've used, and I've felt very successful with it because it really catches my blind spots and my, you know, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, or the character does something and it's not earned out. So that when I get feedback from my writers group or my agent, it's like, yeah, she does this decision, but there's no reason for it. I don't believe she'd do it. So this will catch those and keep you honest, I
I
guess.
think, yeah, I love that.
Right.
So much fun. Well, Mary, thank you so much for this great conversation about arcs.
Yeah.
And you've given the listeners and viewers one place where they can go to find out more information about that topic, but where can they go to find out more about you and everything you do online?
MaryCarrollMoore.com. You got the spelling of my name there, 2 R's, 2 L's, 2 O's. And on that, I also have my link to my weekly Substack newsletter, which is your weekly writing exercise where I give these techniques in a little essay every week. So that's free, and people can sign up for that if they'd like to get a little boost to their writing every Friday. And I also have my books listed on that page on my website, but they're all over the internet too. Any bookseller, you can go and look for A Woman's Guide to Search and Rescue.
Which I can highly recommend.
Thank you, Maddie. I love
Sure.
that.
Thank you, Mary.